The final straw came when Wallace refused Truman's request to remain silent on foreign policy matters. The president had hoped for a compromise where Wallace could stay in the cabinet while ceasing his public criticism. But Wallace rejected this arrangement as a betrayal of his principles. According to accounts preserved in the Truman Presidential Library, the president told advisers that keeping Wallace was impossible and that the Commerce Secretary had become a national danger. Wallace's dismissal sent shockwaves through progressive circles. Labor unions, civil rights organizations, and peace activists who had viewed Wallace as their voice within the administration felt betrayed. Thousands of letters and telegrams flooded the White House, protesting what they saw as the silencing of dissent and the abandonment of Roosevelt's vision. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, one of the nation's most powerful labor federations, passed a resolution condemning Wallace's removal. Conservative and moderate Democrats, however, celebrated. Senator Tom Connally of Texas, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, declared that Wallace's departure removed a source of confusion and embarrassment to American foreign policy. The Washington establishment closed ranks around Truman, praising his decision as necessary for national security. Editorial pages of major newspapers, with few exceptions, supported the firing, arguing that cabinet unity on foreign policy was essential during such a dangerous period. For Wallace himself, the dismissal was both devastating and liberating. He had lost his platform within government, his access to classified information, and his ability to influence policy from the inside. But he had gained something else: freedom to speak without restraint, without the constraints of cabinet collective responsibility. Within weeks, Wallace would accept the editorship of the New Republic magazine, giving him a prominent progressive platform from which to wage his campaign against Cold War policies. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's firing revealed how thoroughly the political landscape had shifted since Roosevelt's death. The Democratic Party that had embraced Wallace's progressive vision in 1940 was now actively purging those ideas from positions of power. Truman was consolidating a new Democratic coalition built around anti-communism, military strength, and a more conservative domestic agenda. Wallace represented the road not taken, the alternative future that might have been if Roosevelt had lived or if Wallace had remained vice president. What neither Truman nor Wallace fully understood in September of 1946 was that this firing was not an ending but a beginning. Wallace would not fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, he would launch the most serious left-wing challenge to the Democratic Party in the 20th century, a campaign that would further expose the ideological fault lines in American politics and ultimately doom any realistic chance of avoiding the Cold War. December 30th, 1947, Henry Wallace announced his candidacy for President of the United States on a third-party ticket, directly challenging Harry Truman and the Democratic establishment. 15 months after his firing, Wallace had become the leader of a growing progressive movement that rejected both major parties' embrace of Cold War confrontation. His decision to run would prove to be one of the most consequential and controversial political moves of the era, fundamentally reshaping American politics for generations to come. The Progressive Party, as Wallace's movement called itself, represented a coalition of labor activists, civil rights advocates, pacifists, and those Americans who still believed in Roosevelt's vision of big power cooperation. The party platform called for ending military draft, nationalizing key industries, establishing comprehensive civil rights protections for African Americans, and pursuing immediate peace negotiations with the Soviet Union. It was the most left-wing major campaign platform in American history, and establishment figures on both left and right viewed it with alarm. Wallace's campaign rallies drew enormous crowds in major cities, particularly in New York, California, and the industrial Midwest. Thousands came to hear him denounce what he called Truman's bipartisan reactionary war policy. His speeches painted a dark picture of America, moving toward militarism, with billions of dollars diverted from social programs to military spending while civil rights remained an unfulfilled promise. "We are not afraid of communism," Wallace declared at one rally. "We are afraid of hunger and poverty and war." But from the beginning, Wallace's campaign was plagued by the issue that would ultimately destroy it: communist support and infiltration. The Communist Party USA enthusiastically backed Wallace's candidacy, seeing his opposition to Cold War policies as aligned with Soviet interests. While Wallace insisted his campaign was independent and non-communist, he refused to reject communist support, arguing that all Americans regardless of political belief had the right to participate in democratic politics. This position proved politically catastrophic. Anti-communist liberals, including prominent New Dealers like Eleanor Roosevelt, condemned Wallace's acceptance of communist backing. According to historical analyses documented in academic studies of the period, the Americans for Democratic Action, a liberal organization founded in early 1947, specifically positioned itself as a progressive alternative that excluded communists. Former Wallace allies, including labor leaders like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, broke with him over the communist issue. The question of communist influence in Wallace's campaign was not entirely unfair. Evidence that emerged decades later from Soviet archives revealed that the Communist Party USA, which took direction from Moscow, had indeed played a significant role in organizing Wallace's campaign infrastructure. While Wallace himself was not a communist and genuinely believed in his principles, he was surrounded by advisors who saw his candidacy primarily as a vehicle for Soviet foreign policy objectives. Wallace's civil rights advocacy, which should have been his strongest asset, also proved complicated. His campaign was genuinely integrated at a time when both major parties maintained segregated operations in southern states. Wallace and his running mate, Senator Glenn Taylor of Idaho, faced arrests and violence when they defied segregation laws during Southern campaign swings. This courage was real and admirable, yet it too became tainted by charges that communists were exploiting racial tensions for political purposes. The Democratic establishment launched a sophisticated campaign to destroy Wallace's candidacy. Truman, recognizing the danger Wallace posed to his own re-election chances, moved leftward on domestic policy, proposing civil rights legislation and expanding New Deal programs. This political maneuvering was designed to blunt Wallace's appeal among traditional Democratic constituencies without compromising on anti-communist foreign policy. It worked. By mid-1948, Wallace's campaign was clearly faltering. Unions were withdrawing support, prominent progressives were distancing themselves, and polls showed his support collapsing. But Wallace pressed forward, believing that even in defeat, his campaign could demonstrate that alternatives to Cold War militarism existed. He could not have known that his third-party run would contribute to Truman's near defeat and would be used for decades as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging the Democratic establishment from the left. November 2nd, 1948, the presidential election results delivered a devastating verdict on Henry Wallace's political vision. He received just over 1 million votes nationwide, barely 2% of the total, finishing a distant fourth behind winner Harry Truman, Republican Thomas Dewey, and segregationist Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond. The Progressive Party failed to win a single electoral vote. Wallace, who had once been a heartbeat away from the presidency, had been thoroughly repudiated by American voters. The election results were particularly painful in their geographic distribution. Wallace had hoped to demonstrate strength in industrial states with strong labor movements, but unions had largely abandoned him. He received his highest vote totals in New York, where he garnered over 500,000 votes, but this was still only 8% of the state's total. Even in his home state of Iowa, where he had once been a beloved agricultural secretary, Wallace managed only 12,000 votes. The American people had rejected not just Wallace personally, but the entire progressive vision he represented. Truman's victory, one of the greatest upsets in American political history, came partly at Wallace's expense. The president had successfully reclaimed progressive voters by moving left on domestic policy while maintaining his hard line against Soviet expansion. Truman's whistle-stop campaign had portrayed Wallace as a dangerous radical whose naivete about communism threatened national security. The strategy worked brilliantly, isolating Wallace as too extreme for mainstream liberalism while simultaneously attacking Republicans as heartless reactionaries. The Progressive Party's poor showing had immediate and brutal consequences for those associated with it. In the emerging McCarthy era, Wallace supporters found themselves blacklisted from government jobs. Investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee and branded as communist sympathizers. Academic positions were lost, careers destroyed, families torn apart by loyalty investigations. The price for challenging Cold War orthodoxy was becoming clear, and it was steep. Wallace himself retreated from public life, returning to his farm in South Salem, New York. The man who had once been one of America's most powerful political figures now spent his days experimenting with agricultural techniques and writing occasional articles. He watched with horror as Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade accelerated, seeing in it the fulfillment of his warnings about militarism and paranoia. Yet Wallace's own role in discrediting progressivism by accepting communist support had inadvertently contributed to the very climate that made McCarthyism possible. The long-term impact of Wallace's campaign on American politics cannot be overstated. His defeat effectively ended serious left-wing opposition within the Democratic Party for a generation. Future progressives learned that challenging the party establishment from the left was political suicide. The lesson reinforced by Wallace's failure would echo through decades, constraining democratic politics within a narrow ideological band that accepted anti-communism and American global military dominance as non-negotiable principles. By the early 1950s, Wallace had largely recanted his earlier positions on Soviet cooperation. The Korean War, Stalin's brutal repression in Eastern Europe, and revelations about Soviet espionage in the American government convinced Wallace that he had been wrong about the possibility of accommodation. In a painful public statement, he acknowledged that the Soviet Union is utterly different from what I believed it to be. This recantation was perhaps more devastating than his election defeat, representing the final collapse of his worldview. Yet Wallace never fully renounced his vision of what America could have been. In his remaining years, he would live until November of 1965. He continued to advocate for arms control, economic development, and racial equality. He watched the emerging civil rights movement with satisfaction, believing it vindicated his earlier advocacy. He opposed the Vietnam War, seeing in it the fulfillment of his prophecy that militarism would corrupt American democracy. The historical judgment on Wallace remains deeply contested. Was he a prophetic voice warning against the dangers of militarism and Cold War paranoia? Or was he a naive dupe whose political blindness about Soviet intentions nearly undermined American security at a critical moment? The answer, like most historical truths, likely contains elements of both interpretations. January 12, 1950, barely 14 months after his electoral defeat, Henry Wallace watched as President Truman announced a massive military buildup and the development of the hydrogen bomb. From his farm in New York, the former vice president saw his worst fears materializing. The arms race he had warned against was accelerating, the military-industrial complex he had identified was growing more powerful, and the chance for peaceful accommodation with the Soviet Union was evaporating. History was vindicating his warnings even as it consigned his political career to failure. The National Security Council had just completed NSC-68. A secret document that would define American Cold War strategy for decades. Though Wallace could not know its specific contents, the policy shift was unmistakable. Defense spending would triple over the next several years. Permanent military alliances would extend American commitments across the globe, and covert operations would become routine instruments of foreign policy. The national security state Wallace had warned about was being constructed with bipartisan support and public enthusiasm. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950, seemed to prove Wallace both right and catastrophically wrong. He had warned that militaristic policies would lead to conflict, and here was conflict on a massive scale. Yet the war also seemed to validate everything Truman had said about Soviet-backed aggression and the need for military strength. When North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet weapons and supported by Soviet advisors, poured across the 38th parallel, it appeared to confirm the domino theory that Wallace had dismissed as paranoid fantasy. Wallace's personal isolation deepened as friends and former allies scrambled to distance themselves from any association with him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained an extensive file on his activities, monitoring his correspondence and public statements for evidence of continued communist sympathies. Though Wallace had never been a communist, his politics were those of a Roosevelt New Dealer who believed in American capitalism reformed through democratic socialism. The distinction mattered little in the fevered atmosphere of early 1950s America. The Progressive Party that had nominated Wallace essentially collapsed after the election. Some of its members drifted back into the Democratic Party, accepting defeat and the new Cold War consensus. Others were driven from public life entirely, their careers destroyed by blacklists and loyalty investigations. A few maintained their dissent, continuing to argue for peace and disarmament through small publications and marginal organizations that were heavily infiltrated by FBI informants. Yet even as Wallace's political vision was being repudiated, some of his specific warnings proved accurate. The military spending he had opposed did lead to the neglect of domestic programs. The arms race he had predicted did spiral into mutual assured destruction and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The intervention in developing countries he had warned against did create exactly the pattern of blowback and resentment he had anticipated. His policy prescriptions may have been naive, but his diagnosis of where American militarism would lead was often correct. Wallace spent these years writing and farming, developing hybrid corn varieties and experimenting with agricultural techniques. His scientific work, which had always been his first passion, provided solace from political defeat. He corresponded with agricultural researchers worldwide, including some in the Soviet Union, maintaining the international scientific cooperation he had always advocated even as political relations between nations deteriorated. The cruelest irony of Wallace's political career was that he had been partially right about Soviet intentions while being completely wrong about Soviet methods. Stalin did want security for the Soviet Union after the devastation of World War II, but Stalin's methods for achieving that security, brutal repression, forced collectivization, systematic elimination of dissent were far more horrific than Wallace had imagined or acknowledged. Wallace's tragedy was that he had tried to find the reasonable position between two sides when one side was genuinely unreasonable, and in doing so, he had discredited the legitimate criticisms he had offered of American militarism. By 1953, when Stalin died, Wallace was largely forgotten by American politics. The vice presidency he had held seemed like ancient history, his presidential campaign a bizarre footnote to the Truman years. November 18, 1965, Henry Wallace died at the age of 77 in Danbury, Connecticut, having lived long enough to see the Vietnam War escalate into exactly the kind of military quagmire he had warned against. His obituaries were respectful but puzzled, struggling to make sense of a career that had taken him from the heights of power to political exile and partial rehabilitation. The man who might have been president instead became a cautionary tale, though what exactly the caution was supposed to be remained ambiguous. Looking back across the decades since Truman fired Wallace in 1946, several truths emerge from the historical fog. Wallace was right that the Cold War. That night, as he settled into a hastily prepared command post in a Norman farmhouse, Cota composed reports for higher headquarters. He kept the language spare and professional, avoiding dramatics. He listed objectives achieved, casualties suffered, and positions held. He recommended soldiers for decoration and officers for promotion. He identified weaknesses in training and equipment that needed to be addressed. This was the unglamorous work of command that consumed far more time than dramatic moments on beaches. But Cota knew, as did the men who had watched him that day, that something important had happened on Omaha Beach. Leadership had made the difference between defeat and survival. One general, refusing to accept failure, had helped turn the tide of the most important invasion in military history. The full story would emerge only gradually over the coming months and years, but the men of the 29th Infantry Division, the 5th Ranger Battalion, and the other units that fought at Omaha Beach would never forget what they had witnessed. The campaign in Normandy ground forward through June and July of 1944 with brutal efficiency. Norman Cota remained with the 29th Infantry Division, leading from the front as American forces fought their way through the hedgerows toward St. Lay. The bocage country proved almost as deadly as Omaha Beach, with German defenders using the terrain expertly to exact a heavy toll on advancing American units. On the 23rd of June, Cota was promoted to Major General and given command of the 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard unit known as the Keystone Division. This command represented both recognition of his performance on D-Day and confidence in his ability to lead larger formations. The 28th Division had come ashore after the initial assault and needed an experienced combat leader to guide it through the fighting ahead. Cota led the 28th Division through the remainder of the Normandy campaign and into the pursuit across France following the Allied breakout from Saint-Lay in late July. His division participated in the liberation of Paris on the 25th of August, marching through the Arc de Triomphe in a victory parade that brought tears to soldiers who had survived since Omaha Beach. The war was far from over, but this moment of triumph offered a glimpse of eventual victory. The division continued eastward through the autumn of 1944, fighting through the Hurtgen Forest in one of the war's most brutal and controversial battles. The forest fighting stripped away any romantic notions about combat, replacing them with a grinding attritional struggle that consumed divisions. Cota's leadership during this period proved as crucial as his actions on D-Day, holding together a division under tremendous pressure. Then came December of 1944 and the German Ardennes Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The 28th Division held positions along the Our River when 3 German Army Corps smashed into their sector on the 16th of December. Cota's division was badly outnumbered and outgunned, but it conducted a fighting withdrawal that delayed the German advance and disrupted their timetable. This delay proved crucial to the eventual Allied victory in the battle. For his actions on D-Day, Norman Cota received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation read in part, "Brigadier General Cota personally rallied disorganized units and was the first man over the seawall leading his troops in the charge against the enemy. His courageous and inspiring leadership contributed materially to the success of the invasion." He also received the Silver Star for actions later in the Normandy campaign. The full scope of Cota's contribution became clearer as historians examined the invasion. Multiple accounts from different units described his presence at critical moments. Officers who had fought at Omaha Beach uniformly credited him with helping to break the paralysis that threatened the invasion in its first hours. While many officers and enlisted men showed extraordinary courage that day, Cota's rank and position amplified his impact. When a general leads from the front, it sends a powerful message throughout the chain of command. After the war ended in May of 1945, Cota continued serving in various capacities before retiring from the Army in November of 1946. He had served for 29 years, through 2 world wars, seeing combat in the most important invasion in military history. He could have retired with quiet satisfaction, but the war had taken its toll. Like many combat veterans, he struggled to reconcile the horror he had witnessed with the celebration that greeted returning soldiers. Norman Cota spent his retirement years largely out of the public eye. Unlike some generals who wrote memoirs or remained active in military affairs, he chose a quieter path. He settled with his wife in an unassuming home and avoided the spotlight that increasingly fell on D-Day veterans as the invasion's significance became clear. When historians contacted him for interviews, he cooperated but deflected attention from himself toward the soldiers he had led. The historical memory of D-Day developed gradually in the post-war decades. Initial accounts focused on Eisenhower's strategic decisions and the planning that made the invasion possible. Later works examined the experiences of ordinary soldiers, bringing attention to the chaos and courage at the tactical level. Cota appeared in many of these accounts, but often as a supporting figure rather than a central character. Stephen Ambrose's book D-Day, June 6, 1944, published in 1994 for the 50th anniversary, brought renewed attention to Cota's role. Ambrose interviewed numerous veterans and examined official records, constructing a detailed picture of the invasion. His account emphasized how critical leadership had been in turning the tide at Omaha Beach. Cota emerged as one of the heroes whose actions had salvaged victory from potential disaster. The recognition came too late for Cota himself. He died on the 24th of October, 1971, at the age of 78. He was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick, Maryland, with full military honors but without the fanfare that accompanied the funerals of more famous generals. His passing received modest notice in newspapers, a brief tribute to a career soldier who had done his duty without seeking glory. But memory has a way of correcting such oversights. As the generation that fought in World War II began to pass away, efforts intensified to preserve their stories. The United States Army recognized Cota's contributions by naming facilities in his honor. The 5th Ranger Battalion, which he had led up the bluffs at Omaha Beach, adopted Rangers lead the way as their official motto, memorializing the words he spoke on D-Day. The site of Cota's greatest triumph became one of the world's most hallowed battlefields. The American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach contains 9,387 graves, silent testimony to the price of liberation. Visitors to the beach can still see the bluffs that seemed so insurmountable on June 6, 1944. They can walk the sands where thousands of soldiers fought and died. They can trace the routes that Cota and others used to breach the German defenses. Veterans who survived Omaha Beach carried memories of that day for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with what they had witnessed, the friends they had lost, the randomness of survival. They gathered at reunions, finding comfort in the company of others who understood what they had endured. At these reunions, Cota's name came up frequently. Men would recall seeing him on the beach, his calmness under fire, his willingness to lead from the front. These personal testimonies became part of the historical record, ensuring that his contribution wouldn't be forgotten. The broader lessons of Omaha Beach extended beyond honoring individual heroes. Military historians studied the invasion to understand what went wrong in the planning and what went right in the execution. They noted that leadership at every level made the difference between failure and success. Junior officers like Lieutenant John Spaulding, sergeants like John Pinder, and generals like Norman Cota all demonstrated that courage and initiative could overcome even the most daunting circumstances. The story of Norman Cota in Omaha Beach resonates across generations because it illustrates fundamental truths about leadership, courage, and human potential under extreme stress. The battle represented a moment when the outcome of world history hung in the balance, decided not by grand strategy or technological superiority, but by individual decisions made under fire. Cota's choice to lead from the front, to expose himself to the same dangers facing every private soldier, sent a message that reverberated throughout the chain of command. Modern military leadership training incorporates lessons from Omaha Beach. Officer candidates study the invasion to understand how planning can fail and how leaders must adapt when reality doesn't match expectations. Cota's actions demonstrate principles that transcend specific tactics or technologies. Leaders must be present where the crisis is greatest. They must show courage that inspires others, and they must make decisions even when information is incomplete and consequences are severe. The invasion's success transformed the course of World War II and shaped the post-war world. Without the Normandy invasion, the war in Europe might have dragged on for years, with consequences impossible to calculate. The Soviet Union would likely have controlled more of Europe. Millions more would have died in concentration camps and on battlefields. The atomic bomb might have been used in Europe as well as Asia. The world we inhabit today emerged from those 6,000 yards of Norman coastline. Cota's personal humility contrasts sharply with the magnitude of his contribution. He never claimed to have single-handedly saved the invasion. He understood that thousands of soldiers, from privates to generals, had shown extraordinary courage that day. His role was simply to be in the right place at the right time with the right message. Move forward or die here. This clarity of purpose and willingness to embody his own message made the crucial difference. The 28th Infantry Division, which Cota commanded after D-Day, continues to serve in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. The unit traces its lineage back to the American Revolution, making it one of the oldest in the United States military. Its soldiers deploy regularly to combat zones and disaster areas, carrying on traditions established by men who fought under Norman Cota. The division's history includes Omaha Beach prominently, ensuring that new generations learn about that pivotal day. In Frederick, Maryland, where Cota spent his final years, the local community has worked to preserve his legacy. Historical societies maintain records of his service. Schools teach students about his role in D-Day. Veterans groups ensure that his grave is decorated on Memorial Day and other holidays. These small acts of remembrance accumulate into a collective memory that honors sacrifice and celebrates leadership. The Ranger motto, "Rangers, lead the way," has become iconic, recognized far beyond military circles. It represents not just the actions of one unit on one day, but a philosophy of leadership that remains relevant. Leaders go first. They share danger with those they lead. They demonstrate the courage they expect from others. These principles apply whether someone is leading soldiers in combat, guiding a company through crisis, or mentoring young people facing challenges. As the last veterans of World War II pass away, the youngest survivors are now in their late 90s. The responsibility for remembering transfers to subsequent generations. We preserve their stories not simply as historical curiosities, but as lessons about human capacity for both terrible destructiveness and remarkable nobility. Omaha Beach witnessed both extremes, the horror of industrial warfare and the transcendence of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts. Norman Daniel Cota embodied the latter quality. He was not superhuman, not a character from fiction or mythology. He was a career officer, professionally competent but not spectacular, who found himself in circumstances that demanded everything he had to give. He gave it without hesitation, without concern for personal safety, without calculation of how history would judge him. He simply did his duty as he understood it, leading soldiers who desperately needed leadership at the moment they needed it most. The echoes of Omaha Beach continue to sound across the decades. Every June 6th, ceremonies at the American Cemetery honor those who died on that beach and throughout the Normandy campaign. Dignitaries deliver speeches about sacrifice and freedom. Veterans, fewer each year, return to the place where they fought. Visitors from around the world walk the beach and contemplate what happened there. In these acts of remembrance, Norman Cota's legacy endures, not as a monument to one man, but as a reminder that leadership matters, that courage is contagious, and that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender to fear. The general who helped win D-Day at Omaha Beach left no vast estate, published no famous memoir, sought no lasting fame. He left something better. An example of leadership under fire that continues to inspire all who learn his story.